whilst I was filming this part of the honouring of the Bluebird rail car, I come across a old AN employee which actually used to drive the Bud car, Des Wallace. So what we're going to do is have a chat to Des on the Bud car and the Bluebird, and see if he's got any background of also the other iconic rail car in South Australia, the Red Hen. How are you, Des?
Real good, thanks. Yeah.
That's good. Now, Des, I believe that you mentioned to me that you used to drive one of the Bud cars here in South Australia. Where did you used to drive that one to, Des?
Well, most of my experience on the Bud car was the Wallace to Adelaide line, and that was created, started that run after the federal government built the new standard gauge line from Port Augusta to Wallace, mainly for steel. But they could see that there was a service needed there for passengers, for a daily, for medical reasons and other reasons they need to get to Adelaide. So they refurbished 3 of the Bud cars, spent a lot of money on them, doing them up, and they used them on a daily service. I think my recollection was right, daily service. I know it was about a 6 a.m. departure from Wallace, 10 a.m. into Adelaide, and then about a 4 o'clock departure out of Adelaide and back to Wallace.
Nice. Now, what a lot of people would probably want to know is some of the history, if you know, about the Bluebird and how that used to operate from Adelaide to Peterborough.
Yeah, well, whilst I was never involved with SAR Railways as a driver, we used to be, know a bit of the history in that. The Bluebird was a regular train from Port Pirie to Adelaide through the Snowdown line, and from Peterborough through to Adelaide, through Burra and down that way to Adelaide. Now, that with the changing, there were several things that happened there in the early 60s. The first is to change all these gauges, and that was the standardisation of the Broken Hill to Port Pirie line. And that then meant that the narrow gauge stopping at Tarawi had to be linked somehow into this standard gauge up there. So they made broad gauge that ceased at Tarawi. They broad gauged that 7 mile of track to Peterborough so that there was a direct link then, and do away with that bit of narrow gauge. At the same time, they virtually stopped the old Gann narrow gauge that ran from Peterborough to Pawn and through to Alice Springs that way. The other side of the Bluebirds, of course, they were regularly used on the Mount Gambier Adelaide rail, and the history of that I have no recollections at all, because I wasn't involved with the Adelaide side of things. So the Bluebirds, I'm a little bit phased out.
Okay. Do you know much about the Red Hens at all?
No experience with the Red Hens at all. They were used mainly on the suburban lines, but I do believe they've done a bit of country run on that.
Country run, yeah. Okay. Do you roughly know how the Bluebirds and the Red Hens actually come about?
No, I don't know that.
Well, the Red Hens and the Bluebirds were a spin-off of the Bud car. And what it was the Commonwealth government bought 3 Bud cars from America, where they arrived in Australia at Port Augusta, and they were offloaded. And one of the Bud cars in 1951 was when they arrived. In 1951, for its maiden test journey, they went from Port Augusta to Kalgoorlie in Western Australia, where the testing of the Bud car, obviously for the Australian conditions and the speed and all that, all of the outcome was results were actually what they wanted to know, and it worked. Even though that the poor old speed of the Bud car is only 70 to 75 kilometres an hour, I believe it took almost 18 hours to get from Port Augusta to Kalgoorlie, but that was also with about 35 stops. So what they did was the South Australian government obviously wanted to upgrade their public transport service in the 1960s. So they got the blueprints of the Bud car, and they organised obviously for some engineers and designers, and they all sat down, and they actually, what come out of it was the Bluebird as a luxury regional rail service, mainly on the Peterborough to the Adelaide to Peterborough line, which also branched off to other regional areas in South Australia on a daily basis. Now, the Budcar and the Bluebird were one of they were both luxury cars, as I said. They had air conditioning, they had reclining seats, restrooms, your double windows with your shades in the middle. But one of the other features they had on it as well is you could board anywhere on these rail cars. And what I mean by that is you didn't actually need a station to board the train. The Budcar and the Bluebird both had steps that were basically on ground level. And then shortly after that, in the 1960s, they come up with the Red Hen, a more basic design with no air conditioning, no reclining seats, and doors you had to fight with once the rollers were buggered. So that's just the bit of history on how the Budcar come about. Now, Des, one question I'll finish with is, it's a bit political, but do you roughly know why regional rail and AN stopped in South Australia?
Yes, very political at the time, it was, but I think economics played a big part of it. My early recollection back in those days was the rail, to run a profit, didn't have to take in the infrastructure, maintenance and that type of thing. And it was mainly that they'd have to keep their rolling stuff up, their locomotives up and that sort of thing. But I think the federal government funded the infrastructure, the track and that separately, so it was no problem. But in the early 70s and that, and I think it might have been in the Gough Whitlam early days, that they started looking at this and thinking, you know, you're making a profit. They worked through that and then decided that some of these lines weren't all that profitable, and a way of we can make sure they're not is just don't run them as they should be run, and that'll soon get rid of the last of the few customers we got. And of course, with the introduction of trucks, you can imagine, I can remember the early days of my own experience. I wanted to get a little bit of, I was doing some house renovations, I wanted a new ceiling, and it was only available at Kapunda. To get that to Quorn, it had to go into the city, into Adelaide, be transshipped there, it had to go to Peterborough, be transshipped there, then it had to go to Quorn.
Wow, that's a fair bit of travel.
That's right. And to get 10 sheets of ceiling, and that was 3 weeks it took me to get it there. So you can imagine, I just had to ring up the local transport bloke. He would have picked it up at Kapunda on his way home and had it home the same day. Those sort of logistics changed with the trucking available was. You didn't have your little old single axle trucks running around anymore. You had your semi-trailers that could do it, and they can do in 8 hours what it took a week for a train to do.
Would you also say, because I've also heard rumours from a very good source, that the fate of Australian National was they had to offload it or get rid of it at any cost. And now that order was come from the board of AN, and one of their little aspects that they used, or the way they got rid of the passenger service side of AN, was they changed the timetables of the Bluebirds. So, for example, I was told the Victor Harbour Bluebird service, instead of getting in at a PM time bracket, it would actually get in at 1:15 in the morning, which who would be wanting to catch a train at 11 o'clock at night, or however long it took to get from Victor Harbour to Adelaide, and you get to your destination at 1:15 in the morning. Would you be able to recollect if that's a sort of a true way that they financial reports showed that AN is now not making a profit because they had to offload AN at any cost?
That would certainly be an area in the passenger side of things.
Yep.
And you know, like I said once again, from the Adelaide area down, I didn't have much involved with it at all. But a similar thing was happening in freight. to these smaller country towns. You know, having lived in Quorn all my life, I know, you know, we went from 30 and 40 trains a week up there in the war years to down to just one a week when it finished up there, because the rail couldn't compete with road.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much, Des. It's been brilliant chatting to you. Hopefully I'll be able to chat to you again when I've got some more questions or some more videos to share.
Thanks very much. Very
yeah,
good.